Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good day to everyone. We have so far discussed about these basic concepts of the open economy macroeconomics. We already know the definitions of net export and flows of capital, as well as the connection between the two. We have learned as well how the flow of capital or the financial investment differs but at the same time relates to our physical investment I in our GDP. And the last discussion was about the measurement of prices for international transaction. Here we learned the measurements of both nominal and real exchange rate, and at the end, the purchasing power parity theory or PPP to explain the movement of the nominal exchange rate. Having understood the basics, now we are going to learn further about the long run model of the open economy. We're not talking about the formula or the measurement anymore. We're now talking about the determinants of all the variables we have discussed. We're talking about the market for loanable funds in an open economy, the market for foreign currency exchange, and then the connection between the two markets, and of course the resulting equilibriums in each and interrelated market. Since we're talking about the long run models, we're concerned more about the real variables. We will deal with the real exchange rate, not the nominal exchange rate. We will only involve transaction, situation, or policy that affects real variables such as real trade and real output. Okay, the explanation will be straightforward. I would say this first. Basically, there are two markets in long-run open economy models. First is the market for loanable funds. What you have to understand is here we're talking in the perspective of domestic economy. Supply of loanable funds, as you may observe from the graph, is funds supplied by domestic agents. They are domestic household and domestic government. Their saving or the national saving is the source of supply of loanable funds in the market. Therefore, any change affecting national saving will also affect the supply. This is exactly the same as the supply of loanable funds as we are talking about in the closed economy before the midterm exam. The curve is upward sloping because domestic private saving is affected by domestic interest rate. On the other hand, what we call demand in the market is demand for loanable funds from, again, domestic citizens to conduct investment. But since we're now in an open economy, domestic citizens may still invest domestically. Thus, the I or invest abroad either directly through FDI or indirectly through portfolio investment. Thus, the net capital outflow. Investment made by domestic citizens is again negatively affected by domestic real interest rate. When the real interest rate is high, the cost of borrowing is high too, so there will be less incentive to invest or there will be less demand for loanable funds. The story, however, doesn't end here. In an open economy, high domestic real interest rate may attract foreign savers to purchase assets in domestic economy. But be careful. The capital inflow here is not interpreted as the addition to the supply of loanable funds since it's not part of the national saving. Hence, supply curve will not be affected. Instead, with the capital inflow or lower net capital outflow, there will be less demand for national savings or the loanable funds because part of the domestic investment now is financed using more funds from abroad. So, it's clear now both I and NCO are negatively affected by real domestic interest rate. Then the final part of the market is the equilibrium. The interaction between supply and demand for supply of and demand for loanable funds result in equilibrium loanable funds and equilibrium of domestic real interest rate. Please keep it in your mind. Equilibrium of real interest rate is not set by anyone. It results from the interaction of supply and demand in the market. Therefore, it can only change if something happens to the supply or the demand. The second market is the market for foreign currency exchange or market for real exchange rate. In this market, we're talking about the determinants of real exchange rate of the domestic economy and their foreign counterpart economy. Just like the real interest rate, the real exchange rate is also determined from the market, not fixed or set by anyone. If the real exchange rate in question is rupiah, or we treat Indonesia as our domestic economy, we're dealing with supply of and demand for rupiah in the market. Supply of rupiah means amount of rupiah to be exchanged into foreign currency. It is not country's money supply, remember. It is the excess of national saving that flies abroad in the form of net capital outflow. From the discussion earlier, we know that NCO, or net capital outflow, is affected by real interest rate, not real exchange rate. Therefore, since NCO, or the supply of rupiah, is not affected by real exchange rate, the supply curve is vertical. Yes, of course, when rupiah is appreciated or now more expensive relative to Malaysia's ringgit, for example, rupiah can buy more Malaysia's asset, the foreign asset, and vice versa. But the relatively lower cost of purchasing Malaysia's asset will be cancelled out with the relatively lower benefit received from owning them. The dividend from Malaysia's asset will be in ringgit, so when it is converted to rupiah, the asset owner will receive less rupiah. That's the basis why Q in his book assumed no effect of real exchange rate to net capital outflow. Other than that, of course, the assumption is made to make the situation simpler. Okay, let's now turn to demand for rupiah. Demand for rupiah comes from net export. When Indonesia exports more of their goods and services abroad, the sales may be in rupiah or in foreign currency. Whichever currency being used, it results in more demand for rupiah. If the transaction is in rupiah, foreign citizens would need to exchange their currency to rupiah for buying the goods and services. Hence, higher demand for rupiah. If the transaction is in foreign currency, domestic citizens who have received the foreign currency need to convert the money to rupiah for those can be spent in the domestic economy. Thus, again, higher demand for rupiah. Why is the demand curve negatively correlated with the real exchange rate? The answer is quite straightforward. We know that the real exchange rate shows the relative price or the terms of trade of two countries. So when real exchange rate is high in our case, it means goods and services in Indonesia are relatively more expensive than its counterpart. There will be less net export as a consequence or less demand for rupiah. On the contrary, if the real exchange rate is low, goods and services are now cheaper, so more net export and more demand for rupiah. Hopefully clear? We have talked about the two markets, market for loanable funds and market for real exchange rate. From the first market, we get the equilibrium of the domestic real interest rate. From the second market, we get the equilibrium of the real exchange rate. If we take a look at the two markets altogether closely, there is a link between the two markets. The link is net capital outflow, or NCO. It is part of the demand for loanable funds in the first market that is affected by real interest rate. NCO is also a supply of the domestic currency in the second market that determines the real exchange rate. So, with the NCO link, we can have simultaneous equilibrium in the two markets. This is how the two market graphs are linked with the NCO. We have downward sloping curve of NCO because of its negative correlation with real interest rate. And the amount of NCO is directly derived to get the supply curve of the real exchange rate market. With this framework, we can evaluate how the trade balance, the real exchange rate, and the real interest are determined in the market. Once again, I have to remind you, both equilibriums of real interest rate and real exchange rate are not set. They are determined from the market mechanisms. So any event, situation, or policy that affect S, I, NCO, and NX will affect the equilibrium. We may begin with the first case. What if government runs budget surplus, just like in our exam questions? With budget surplus, public saving will increase and accordingly will also increase national saving. The increase in saving then shift the supply curve of loanable funds to the right from S to S prime. As a consequence, we have the second condition, which is the new and lower level of real interest rate equilibrium at R2. At lower interest rate, both domestic investment and NCO will increase. In the second diagram, the condition of lower interest rate and higher NCO is shown. It is condition of number 3. Then with more NCO, we get the fourth condition, which is the situation in the last diagram. More NCO leads to the shifting of supply of rupiah to the right to SRP prime, resulting in lower rate of real exchange rate equilibrium at E2, which is our last condition in this situation. So what's the conclusion? With government budget surplus, we have lower equilibrium real interest rate. That's one thing. And secondly, we have more domestic investment, more net capital outflow, more quantity of rupiah in the market. And lastly, we have lower real exchange rate equilibrium. How about the second case? Suppose now government provides subsidy for CPO export. And here the process will be shorter than before. Because of the export subsidy, as we can observe from the blue diagram, net export will increase, leading to the shift of the demand curve to the right to DRP prime, and it results in higher real exchange rate to E2. But look, net export remain the same, so no change to NCO nor to the market for loanable funds. So it will stop here. It will only, so the export subsidy will only change the equilibrium real exchange rate. Now the third case, let's see if there is, for instance, political instability resulting in capital flight. What will be the impact of the capital flight? First, let's take a look at the white diagram. Because of the capital flight, there will be an increase in net capital outflow, shifting the net capital outflow diagram, the curve, to NCO prime. And with more NCO, look at the green diagram now, there will be an increase in demand for loanable funds, shifting the demand to DLF prime. And as a result, equilibrium real interest rate increases to R2, which leads to the increase in domestic investment equilibrium and NCO. And then again, at the same time with more NCO, it will be reflected in the blue diagram with the increase in supply of rupiah. As we can observe, there will be a shifting of rupiah, supply of rupiah to SRP prime. And at the end, we have a lower equilibrium real exchange rate at E2. So because of the capital flight, we can summarize the real interest rate equilibrium is now higher. And then domestic investment as well as the net capital outflow will be higher too. And lastly, we have lower real exchange rate equilibrium. And lastly, this is when, for instance, real interest rate of the counterpart economy abroad increases. Higher real interest rate abroad makes foreign assets more attractive, thus increasing net capital outflow. Afterward, the process continues exactly like in the previous capital flight case. Real interest rate increases to R2, domestic investment and NCO increase too, and real exchange rate equilibrium will be depreciated or lower. Okay, that's all from me.